From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. As regular listeners to Take on the South well know, I frequently interview guests who know so much more about the topic under consideration than I do. And today is absolutely no exception to that rule. Today's topic is so alien to me that I can honestly tell you I have almost no experience with it whatsoever. Almost. Today, Take on the South considers the subject of bourbon. I even want to say Bourbon instead of bourbon. Think of this episode as a novice's guide to bourbon, because that's what it is. To help this novice navigate what bourbon is, where it comes from, why it's Southern, and a host of many other pressing questions, we have G.C. Ramey, President and founder of the Gamecock Bourbon Society, staff member of the History Department, and adjunct English professor at the University of South Carolina. G.C., welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're also going to have and loop in the Assistant Director of the Institute for Southern Studies, Dr. Matt Simmons, who knows a lot about bourbon too, because I don't, and my questions will exhaust this quite quickly, and then you two can just talk about what you know. Where to begin? Where are you from, first of all?
So I'm originally from Greenville, South Carolina.
All right, so you're a Southerner.
I am a Southerner.
Okay.
Interesting story kind of that ties in with this bourbon connection is my family are tried and true Southern Bible Belt teetotalers, no alcohol whatsoever. And so my journey into doing what I do was quite interesting, because I was always told, stay away from it. And now part of my living is made by talking bourbon.
All right.
So it's very interesting dynamic there.
Yeah. All right. So tell us about what you do with the Gamecock Bourbon Society. What is the function of that society?
Yeah. So it is sort of just like a collaboration of like-minded individuals who love the University of South Carolina. We love Gamecock athletics, but we also enjoy bourbon. I tell people all the time that it's those two crazy, passionate fan bases. Mm-hmm. If you are a Gamecock fan, you know that we have suffered through loss after loss and terrible seasons, but we still show up and we show out. Likewise, bourbon fanatics are the only people that will get up at 3 a.m. in the morning to wait outside in the cold for a liquor store to sell you an overpriced bourbon that you can't find elsewhere. And I find myself in both of those parties. I will camp out for season tickets, and I'll also camp out for bourbon that's there. And so that collaboration or that connection of those two passionate fan bases just made a lot of sense. My wife and I were living in Charlotte. She's a doctor here at Prisma, and so when we found out she was going to be moving for her residency to Columbia, the Gamecock Bourbon Society was my way of just trying to make a couple friends.
Sure.
I never expected it to blow up into 7,000-8,000 members, which what we have, and events. And now, honestly, I have some lifelong friends. But at the core root of it, it's about educating people on bourbon, showing the historical value of it, and then last but not least, maybe convincing them to give it a taste or two, because there's a lot of value in how good it tastes as well.
Have you found that people are quick converts to bourbon? I mean, once they taste it, they're in, or?
Usually it's the opposite, I'll be honest. If they just go off of the taste, like me, I remember 21, I tried Wild Turkey 101 for the first time, and I swore I would never drink whiskey again.
But is that strong?
It is strong. Generally you're looking for, your bourbon has to be at least 80%. So that 80 proof, you're 40% ABV, 80 proof, and so that's a very light on the palate. Once you start getting above that 100 proof, then it starts to get a little hot. But yeah, I was convinced that whiskey was not for me, and then I started to learn more about the product itself and the value that it brought. So when we have people just randomly taste whiskey or bourbon for the first time, there is usually they're making that face, they're grimacing, they're not enjoying the heat on it, they're not enjoying it. But then we talk about what actually went into the process of making it, how it has positively affected American history, and people start to say, hey, I might be able to get used to this because, essentially bourbon is a time capsule. You're looking back to ages and ages ago, generations of hard work that went into this. And so when you pop open a new bottle of bourbon, whether it be a 6-year or a 23-year, you're drinking history. And people are fascinated by that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, actually, sell me on it then. Sell me on bourbon as somebody who just doesn't... I've sniffed it, right? Okay. And I didn't like. It was just like it's too strong. I don't know what it was, but so sell me on bourbon as an artifact, as part of American and Southern culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it is America's native spirit. In 1964, Congress decided that it was a distinctive American product. So that means that you can go through every other criteria that is in the process and regulations of making a bourbon, and if you make it in Canada instead, even though you followed every other ingredient and recipe on that list, it would not be considered bourbon. It'd be considered just a whiskey. There's a famous saying that says that all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon.
Gotcha.
There is a regulation that you have to follow in these little steps. And so because it's a distinctive American product, first of all, that's a claim to fame that we have. I love Scotch. I love Irish whiskey. I love some cognac. But those things are not things that were built where I was from or where I was born to. And so the Southern culture of it being really prominently developed in the Kentucky area, some connections of New Orleans, which is where I went to graduate school, and Bourbon County, and some of these really fun historical names pop up. And so looking at it, not only is it an American thing, but these frontiersmen are the ones who started to find just realistic and logical ways to preserve corn. And so they distilled it, they put it in barrels, and then from there we have this great product that is now, I think, going through its next big, awakening. Bourbon goes up and down, ebbs and flows, and we are currently in this big bourbon boom that I hope the bubble pops soon, because I would love to be able to afford some of these bottles again.
So we're in a bourbon boom, huh?
I think so.
Okay.
You see a lot of people, younger people, who are gravitating. They're moving away from clear spirits that are getting into whiskey, which are things that they saw their grandparents drink.
So as a novice, I go into a liquor store and, tell me what the kind of regular bourbon is that I would buy, and then give me a really high-end version, a kind of marquee version.
Yeah.
When you say regular, do you mean like
I don't know, like your average
mid-price
person.
quality, or do you mean like rock good stuff frat boys get drunk on?
Okay. The regular stuff where I wouldn't have some kind of internal injury, right?
That is a good point.
Okay, is it really?
That's a good point.
Yeah. You could get an internal injury.
Maybe not, but it can lead to those things. The actions that come from it, of course.
Okay, all right. Well, yes, I get the implication. So let's just say I just want, I know one, Maker's Mark, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's what how would you characterize that?
So that's tricky. First of all, we're giving a massive shout out to Maker's Mark because of our connection with the university to Rob Samuels. His grandfather was just an absolute bourbon legend. His grandmother, Margie Samuels, created the iconic red wax dip label, and he is a graduate of the University of South Carolina and is still heavily involved with production and leadership of Maker's Mark. So we love it. Some people would say that Maker's Mark is a lower tier product, but they have higher end stuff available and they have limited releases. So it's really hard to judge just based off of that bottom level of anything because there's these special products. But I will say Maker's is a quality product. It's something that I use as a mixer in most things. I can drink it straight, drink it neat, and what I like about it is the mash bill, or the recipe that creates the bourbon, is a higher wheat content. And I love the sweetness and the flavor from that wheat. And so Maker's is a great product for that. You talked about some of the higher end ones. Anything that is considered allocated, essentially that is the rare, hard to find bourbons. Okay. They are so popular, and the supply does not match the demand, that essentially what happens is that they only allocate a certain amount of cases of these bourbons to each state, city, liquor store, restaurants. And so products like the Buffalo Trace products, your Eagle Rare, your Blanton's, your E.H. Taylor, and some of the higher ones like George T. Stagg and the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection are almost impossible to find. Does not necessarily mean that they are better quality, but because of the rare value of them, people struggle to find them, and so they're willing to pay a lot more for it. Personally, as far as money goes, I teach here at the university. I work in the history department. I don't make a lot of money. I like to have the best bang for my buck.
Sure.
I like to spend something that I can find every time I go into a store that's in that $50, $60 range for me, and that's where I usually lean to the Elijah Craig products. My favorite being the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof.
I'm guessing, and I don't know this, but I'm guessing that marketing plays a really significant role in kind of framing what is the flavor of the month and what have you. And I'll give you an example. My brother-in-law is a keen bourbon drinker, and he'd mentioned that he wanted this Jefferson bourbon, whatever this is. And one of the things it marketed itself as, it'd been on a ship or something. What's this called? Jefferson what?
Jefferson's Ocean, and then they have broken down to different voyages, which is another marketing
so this
gimmick.
is true. So they actually put the bourbon in a ship, and they go over the ocean to.
That's the premise behind it, and they do it. So quick note, real quick, about how bourbon is aged, because I think it does kind of play into whether that is an authentic gimmick or not.
All right.
I'm a little skeptical. But I will say, when clear whiskey or the White Dog goes into a bourbon barrel, it absorbs the color from the oak staves of the barrel.
Gotcha.
It also gets its flavor from it, and for it to be an authentic bourbon, you can't add anything else to it. You can't change the flavor, can't change the color. The only thing that it can do is you can add a little bit of water to mess with the proof and bring it down. But when you get that product in the barrel, what's interesting is that though it's the same recipe, same barrel, same aged statement, so if it's in there for 12 years, two different barrels can be completely different when their products come out. And this is things like climate, things like where it's sitting in a rick house or the barrel house. All of these things will change the flavor of the bourbon, because during the hot summer months, you have this expansion, and during the cold winter months, you have this condension. And so as all these things are coming into play and the flavor's changing, the climates can affect that. Jefferson said, hey, well, what would happen if we, instead of put a barrel in a rick house, we put it on a boat, we change the climate, we let it roll around a couple times at the bottom of, this ship as it's out in the ocean, and they said that it was strong enough to influence the flavor. I've tasted it, compared it to some other things, and I think it's a really clever gimmick, but it might just be a gimmick.
So I didn't know about this. I was under the impression that, because I've never had the Jefferson's Ocean, but I was under the impression that the reason they were doing it was to accelerate the aging process, so that in 3 years or something like that, they could get, equivalent to several more years, right? Because of the way the violence of the ocean is shoving the whiskey more and more into the pores of the wood. But I didn't. So I don't know. Again, I don't know if that actually makes a little more sense, like from a physical chemical standpoint, than what you're saying. So maybe what I heard was itself someone trying to justify the marketing gimmick there. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think that there is some truth to that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many different ways that would probably be more affordable to sort of expedite that process. Using smaller barrels, that's something that some companies like Lone Elm in Texas, they use smaller barrels to age the process, to expedite it and get whiskey prepared quickly. But what's interesting about it, and the reason that I'm kind of maybe fully invested in this idea that it's a marketing gimmick, is they recently come out with a new one where they aged it in humidity. And so the Jefferson's Humidity Edition, I don't know the exact name of it, just came out on the market. They're charging a fortune for it, and the only difference is that the barrel, instead of sitting in Kentucky or somewhere else, it is sitting in a place with high humidity, and they're saying that it changes the flavor. Buffalo Trace did something similar. A couple years back, a tornado hit the Buffalo Trace distillery, and it took out the top part of one of their rick houses, which is where they age E.H. Taylor, which is a high-end product. Because it took them a while to fix the rick house, it was exposed to outside temperatures during this tornado. Being brilliant marketing geniuses that they are, what did they do? They slapped a special label on it. They called it the Tornado Survivor Edition, the Warehouse C Edition, and they're charging anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 a bottle for something that normally be priced about $60 or $70.
This is genius.
The funny part is that people are buying it. People are paying, just insane amounts of money for this product because it's a once in a lifetime type of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's really important about a lot of this stuff. This marketing stuff, as much as it is kind of silly, just marketing doesn't actually change the flavor of anything that much. And if it did, could you actually perceive it? I don't really think we should make fun of that, because in some ways what people are buying, particularly with bourbon, is just what you're saying. They're buying participation in a story more than anything else, right? So yeah, it's collectors and collectors doing collector things, in whatever. Sure. But you're also participating in a very American, a very Southern story and heritage that goes way back, right? Not only to the idea of the West, to the idea of the frontier. The first serious challenge in post-Constitution, post-1787 America is the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. All these things, which of course that's Western Pennsylvania, but you do end up with a sort of Southern connection. Eventually, we have a lot of the same settlers from that part of Pennsylvania end up, coming down the Shenandoah, the Great Wagon Road and everything, and settling in the South and going to places like Kentucky and Tennessee and these sort of things. There's always these stories that are involved with it that in some ways make it so interesting, right?
Yeah.
And, the bottle itself in some ways is as valuable as the liquid inside the bottle to the connoisseur, which I ain't a connoisseur. Sounds like GC is actually something, at least an aficionado, right?
I try to be.
Yes. But even I, who am not going to go spend that kind of money just for the story, am still kind of entranced by some of these stories, just the poetry of it, right?
No, it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, plus it is a very American marketing ploy, right? Yeah. I mean, it is clever. I'm not sure I'd spend money on it. All right, let me get to the kind of the aesthetics of this, right? Okay. Because you've used some really interesting terminology when you're talking about it. You talked about notes and, the deep flavors and what have you. Do you ever do like blind taste tests? Like, like you have 3 different bourbons there, and is it like a sommelier where you're trying to describe and capture the essence of what the taste is, which is very difficult to do because our vocabulary, it betrays us. We don't really have a very good taste or gustatory vocabulary. But have you done that? Have you sort of had a blind test? This is this, and do you do that on a regular basis?
Yes. So that is honestly when we have events with the Gamecock Bourbon Society, we do a lot of tastings. I think tastings are a unique way to experience bourbon. Oftentimes we start by sharing the history. We start by sharing the story. And Matt, just going back real quick on what you said, your comment about the story behind it is just so pivotal of what caused me to jump into bourbon. I didn't like the taste, but I fell in love with the story. And so I think that captivating people with that is really a good step forward to getting them to taste it. Once we get into the blind tasting, the reason I prefer blind tasting is because you're able to take, we can at least, whether it's clever marketing or genius or, you think that it might be off-putting, Buffalo Trace is killing the market right now. They are absolutely just destroying it because they are on top of the game. I mean, they are the ones that people are going after because they're great. They have a storied history. They have some of the best past distillers that have ever walked this earth. They have some great products. But if you were to take Buffalo Trace as a brand and you were to compare it with a Wild Turkey or some of the other ones like maybe a Four Roses, Old Forester, then you would automatically lean towards the Buffalo Trace product because of a brand bias. You heard that it's good. You know that it's good. Right. People go crazy to chase this. They're not going as crazy to chase some of these other products. When you put it in a blind tasting, suddenly you remove the brand bias, and you're just tasting it for the quality of the product itself.
And how does it fare when you do that?
There have been times that I have chosen, Pappy Van Winkle's the big one. The Van Winkle Lot B 12-year, I did it in a blind tasting with several bourbons, and I ended up choosing the Wild Turkey Rare Breed. Wild Turkey Rare Breed is a $60, $70 bourbon, fantastic. It blew my mind, and I said, that has to be the Pappy product because it's so good. And of course, when my wife revealed, nope, this is Wild Turkey, it changed my perspective on how I looked at Wild Turkey. So you're right, blind tasting really does, it forces you to try to look for several things. First of all, you're looking at the proof. You're not knowing the proof, but drinking it, can you pick up that it's a high proof or a low proof? Right. Then you're looking for the different flavors that you pick up. You're nosing it or getting the smell from it. What notes or what flavors do you pull from it? What is the mouthfeel? And then, to me, I think the most important part, at least is a personal preference, is how it finishes. I like a strong, lingering finish. I want it to tingle in your mouth as it, you're getting ready to go into your next thing that you're ready to drink, and you're still thinking, wow, that Wild Turkey Rare Breed, I can still taste it. That's great. There's some great bourbons that have a short finish. You drink it and then you forget it pretty quickly. And so those are some of the things that I take into consideration with these blind tastings.
Do you have to cleanse your palate in between, I'm guessing, right?
Yes, I definitely would. Just some water, clear that out. It's also important to mix in the water because blind tastings can get you by surprise. You have a couple, 5 or 6 different, nice pours, samples, and having a little bit of water in there to hydrate you keeps your palate ready and keeps you focused.
I was going to ask you about this. So what's the most common way to drink bourbon? Is it neat, on the rocks, or with water added? I mean, obviously people have their preferences, but what's the aficionado's preferred way?
Matt, you might be able to attest to this. It has been said so often that if you are a true bourbon expert, you have to drink it neat. I prefer to drink it neat. I think you do as well.
I drink it neat with two exceptions. If it is a very high proof, so you're talking about barrel age, you're talking about not barrel age, but barrel strength, barrel proof. Yeah, you're getting up to 120 or so proof. What happens there is the alcohol gets so hot, I can't taste anything else. And so with that, I do run a little bit of still water in it. And then during the winter, I will sometimes on a nice, cold night, make an old-fashioned, by which I mean sugar cube, 3 dashes of Angostura, 3 dashes of orange bitters, a little bit of water, crush the orange cube, stir that all up, 1 big cube of ice, bourbon on top, swirl it together, orange rind, that's it, right? And other than that, I drink it neat. That's how I do it. Now, I will say, it is true that if you put just even like an 80 proof, like an 86 proof, my standard is Old Forester, right? So that's an 86 proof, just the average age statement on just the standard bottle of that. And then the 1870, which is delicious, is I think 90 proof. Sometimes it is kind of nice just to put a drop of still water in that, not really to cool the alcohol off, because I don't put enough to do that, but it does change slightly, not really on the tongue, but in the nose especially. It changes some of the way that I'm sure that a chemist could tell you what's actually happening, right? But it does change a little bit about how it comes off in that way. So I do know some people that swear by just a little tiny splash of water, and I see that. I tend to prefer that kind of just neat nose. I do. So
I'm the same way, but the reason I bring that up is that there's almost with everything, there's almost a toxic version of the fan base that say you have to do it one certain way, and if you don't, somehow you're failing, somehow you're just a pretender or a poser. At the Gamecock Bourbon Society, we just want you to drink and enjoy it. So if it is in a cocktail, awesome. If it's with ice cubes or water, if it is a mix of, I hate the idea of putting Coca-Cola in bourbon and just ruining it, but if it makes you appreciate the story and the product, and the most important part of all, the community around you, they say that it does not matter what you're drinking. It's all about who you're drinking with. And that's really how we live our lives there.
Yeah, Mark, I want to ask you a question. As a sensory historian, you said something a few moments ago, talking about the limitations of our vocabulary for, Gustaffery, perception. When you do work in sensory history, 19th century sensory history, because I know you've done quite a bit of that, do you see references to whiskey, to other types of drinks, and is there a sort of a sensory historical way in which we can read something like bourbon? So this is you said this is not your wheelhouse. This may be a way to put it in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, and that's precisely what I was thinking as I was listening to you, GC. I mean, most of my stuff on taste in the 19th century is on food, and it's really kind of silly of me not to think about whiskey and
We've
cider.
just given you a new book project.
Perhaps. I mean, it would be a great dissertation topic, right, for a PhD student. But I'm really thinking of work that's been done on the history of taste in France, for example, where if you think about the way that wine is described, it's a very limited vocabulary. So, and most of the words are borrowed from the other senses. So it's oaky. What does that mean? It's more of a tactile thing. It's like it's a rub, isn't it? Or most of the vocabulary is kind of visual. It's light, right? Or it's dark, or it's sparkling. These are kind of visual ways to describe a taste. And we know what you mean, but it lacks a kind of precision, right? So I think what I'm hearing from you is that this is a community that discusses what something tastes like, but precisely because the vocabulary is so plastic, it kind of invites further conversation, right? So what does it mean when you say it's that? And you're kind of searching for words, and you're searching for a way to frame it. And that's a really healthy and interesting conversation piece, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that what's interesting when we were going through some of these tastings, like you said, it does invite the discussion. You would think that when you're making a decision on, for example, a private barrel, that's something that we're doing.
What do you mean by private barrel?
So a private barrel, most distilleries have a program where a group or a liquor store, in our case it is the Gamecock Bourbon Society, we are going and we're tasting multiple full single barrels, and we're choosing one that they're going to bottle and put our logo on. And so we have released 3 or 4 already. We have a couple more that are coming down the line. And so over the last few weekends, I've been going to different places, and we're tasting. They might give you anywhere from 3 samples of different full barrels or 10. And I'm getting my tasting team. We have a nice curation team of different people with different palates. And we're tasting and sampling and then trying to come up with one choice. What is going to be our barrel? So some of the things we're thinking is, do you like it personally? I hope so. But more importantly than that, do we think that consumers are going to like it? Because I like high proof stuff. Maybe it's too hot for the normal consumer, so I might try to look for something that's more in the middle. If it has any kind of unique flavor or kind of like a funky taste to it that might sell well, that might be something we look at. But at the end of the day, we're looking for quality. Now, you would think in those types of situations, there would be arguments and brutal discussions and battles and debates over, I want A and I want C or B, whatever it is. But as you start to talk and you start to try to describe using a vocabulary that is just inadequate, you try to say like oaky, you try to say, oh, there's some notes of vanilla. It doesn't really taste like vanilla, does it? It's kind of hard to figure out exactly what it tastes like. So you use some of these common words that kind of get the point across. Yeah. But what's interesting about it is that as we're influencing one another with these words, suddenly maybe there's something scientific there, but my brain starts to pick up on the terms that other people have used. My friend Paul Miles, he's our director of development, he swears that the new Maker's Mark limited release tastes a little bit like banana. And when I tried it, now all I can pull is banana from it. And before that, I didn't get any of that. Suggestion is effective. And so what we try to do is while we're discussing and we're trying to go off of each other, these brainstorming sessions to figure out what we like and what we don't like, we try to actually have no conversation during the tasting first. You write down notes of each bottle that you're sampling from the barrel, and then at the end we bring them together and discuss, because that way we don't suggest and change each other's point of view. More times than not, we have all come down to one or two options, which we then pull from. So you'd think there'd be arguments, but there is a beauty to the discussion of what it tastes like.
Scientific almost, right?
Almost.
I mean, you're trying to keep, it's a blind study, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want any unfair influence.
No, I like this. Let me just ask you this. You said you like high proof, right? What's the highest proof bourbon there is?
So that gets difficult, because they have some that they're technically not allowed to sell that could be a little higher. Looking at the regulation, and I hate to nerd out on the rules,
That's
because
all right.
this is what I'm into.
Yeah.
But what makes a bourbon, proofing really does come into that.
Okay.
So just quickly, this might be interesting for other people. There's what's called the ABCs of bourbon. So A is American made. For it to be considered a bourbon and not a whiskey, has to be American made. B is usually barrel, so it has to be aged in an oak, new, charred barrel. Actually, technically, it says container on the legal definition, but it's most often a barrel. The reason for that is because you could be as weak as I am and still roll a barrel.
Okay.
But if you got a box, it's going to be hard to move, because those things are very heavy.
Okay.
C is the ingredients, corn. And so your mash bill has to be at least 51% corn. The other 49% can make up any combination of wheat, rye, and barley. D, this is where the proofing comes in. So this is where the point gets to. It has to be stilled at no higher than 160 proof. And so you can't go higher than that at distillation. So E is the entry proof. When it enters the barrel, it can be no higher than 125. Most distilleries try to pull things into the 110, 115 because they said it gives some room to grow. If you ever see a label on a bottle that says full proof, you know that it's a 125 proof, because that is the full proof that it entered the barrel when it came out. F, and there's only two more, F is the fill proof. When it's filled into the bottle, it can be no less than 80. And then finally, it's genuine, no additives, no flavor changings. And so by looking at the ABCs, what constitutes bourbon, the high proof usually is in that 160, but you're not going to see that hardly ever. Once it gets up to that, they start calling it hazmat bourbon, and it is not fun. It's not enjoyable. The highest proof bottle that I own is a Stag Junior that's in probably, I think, like the 141, 142 range. A couple weeks ago, I was in North Carolina at Broad Branch Distillery, a little small local place. They let me sample a 166 proof rye, and there was just nothing fun about it. It was just like drinking straight gasoline. And so there probably are a few that's higher than that Stag Junior, but I can't imagine them going too much over the 145 range.
So let's talk about this, because I knew about the 80 at the bottom. I didn't know about this distill proof, entry proof. I knew about fill proof. I didn't know that's what it was called. But and I know how you get from the barrel strength to the bottle strength. That has come from dilution with water and so on and so forth. How do they end up with the difference between the distill proof and the entry proof? Where does that come from?
From the distilled proof?
Yeah, to the entry proof.
Okay. I mean, it has added water to that as well.
That's water as well. So it's
Yes.
not the volatilization of the alcohol itself evaporating off. It's just water added to it.
There's probably some evaporation. I mean, that's the reason why, we talked about Pappy Van Winkle. One of the main reasons that Pappy Van Winkle, especially the 23 year, is so expensive is because you have this barrel and every year evaporation takes a percentage of it. That's called the angel share. They say, the angels are taking their share of the bourbon. Once you get to 23 years, you have just a small fraction in that giant barrel, and so you don't have much to bottle. On the other side, they call it the Devil's Cut, which I think Jim Beam had a Devil's Cut bottle. The wooden staves absorb a lot of information, or a lot of bourbon from it, and so you're robbed of a lot of product. So evaporation does play a big role in bourbon overall, but to get
with the proof
from the distillation into the entry proof, water is usually what's used to bring it down below that 125, and then from there into the barrel.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I'm kind of curious about kind of the extremes, as you can probably tell. It's like absurd proofs of 160 or what have you. You mentioned earlier that people are spending $1,500 on a bottle. What's the most expensive you've ever heard of?
Oof. There's some out there that, okay, first of all, there's a difference between the retail pricing on it and what people are willing to pay, the secondary market. The secondary market is technically legal, but it is huge. You can see Facebook groups where people, I mean, I get invites to these things all the time. And
technically legal or illegal?
Technically illegal. Okay. Yeah, I want to make sure it is illegal. Yeah. Secondary market is illegal. And so if you get those Facebook invites, I would just say just delete them. You don't want any part of that at all.
Because they're all feds in there trying to...
Probably so. But why would you want to pay more for something when the retail price on it is so much lower? So with that being the sort of, the retail price and the secondary price.
Right.
The highest retail price that I've seen is probably the Woodford Reserve. I can't remember that the decanter. What is it, Baccarat?
Yeah.
They have a special Baccarat edition where the decanter is worth more than the bourbon inside. I think it's somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 for that bottle. But you're paying for a piece of art.
Yeah.
It is absolutely astounding and beautiful. So that's one of the higher retail pricing. Eagle Rare has a 20-year version called the Double Eagle Very Rare. I know that's kind of a what a creative name for it.
The Double Eagle Very Rare.
But it has a beautiful crystal decanter with a crystal eagle inside of it. The pricing is somewhere around that $1,500, $1,700. But when it comes to secondary market, Buffalo Trace has a product called OFC, and OFC is by far their Rolls Royce. That's their top tier model. They had a release a couple years ago. Their 1994 was when it was bottled, and so this is older than my wife. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but 1994 was when it was bottled, and it's been released. And this thing, secondary market had it going from $25,000 to $40,000 for it. One of my buddies, Jake Johnson, who owns a liquor store here in town, he has one of them. He did not pay that for it. He was able to get one for a retail price. I don't know exactly how much that was, but it just kind of shows you the extremes of it.
Yeah.
Me personally, let me tell you about my favorite budget bourbon, Old Granddad 114. It's a Jim Beam product. No more than $30, 114 proof, one of the best buys. You can find it everywhere, and I would stack it up against almost anything. I always have it on the bar. And so if people are looking to maybe get into bourbon, try some things, learn more about the story, that's a good one to start off with without breaking your budget.
That's very helpful, actually. GC, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but could you tell us if people are interested in engaging with the Gamecock Bourbon Society, how can they reach you? What's the best way to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on just about every social media platform at Gamecock Bourbon. You can find us at gamecockbourbon.com. And then, my email address, gcramey@gamecockbourbon.com. We made it very simple. I work in education. You don't want to confuse people. Keep it as simple as possible. But if I could make one last appeal, I would just say, to those of you who are maybe interested in it, but the flavor or the taste has kind of pushed you off, take in consideration this. In 1897, the Bottled and Bond Act was the first time in American history that a product was able to be secured. You could look, and it was legally protected what was the contents of what was inside that bottle. A couple years later, 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act came in. So this protection of whiskey and liquor and bourbon actually came, 8 or 9 years prior to the Pure Food and Drug Act. And then later in the 1930s or something, what we know as the FDA Act came. So when people say, okay, well, what significance did bourbon actually have on history or the way that we live? I'll say that it was a better product, a more trusted product 9 years earlier than the rest of your food and drugs were. And so to me, I think that's kind of a fascinating look that is just another element of the story of what creates this amazing product so that when you do open a bottle, you really are drinking the history behind it.
You've been very persuasive, and I might join you at some point to be educated further on this. I'm quite tempted. There's a lot more to this than I realised. So thank you for educating me and our listeners generally. GC Ramey, founder of Gamecock Bourbon Society. Thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you both.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.